talk about sort of start the talk, I'd just like to say thanks to you all for coming. We're currently looking at organising more of these sessions for the autumn term. So if anyone here is interested in speaking in a similar event, just get in touch with us and we can talk about it. We're very open to people speaking at these. So today we're joined by Ola Demkowicz, who's a lecturer in the psychology of education at the University of Manchester, and whose research centres on adolescent mental health, with a particular focus on the context and mechanisms that contribute to the emergence of difficulties across adolescence, as well as the factors that may mitigate such vulnerabilities. Ola will be presenting today about co-production with the theme From Tokenism to Collaboration. So if you'd like to get your slides up, and we can get going.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Let me just do that awkward bit of getting the slides going and making sure that everybody can see them. Can everybody see those?
That looks great.
Excellent, thank you so much. Yeah, I was really pleased to be asked to share on this topic. And sort of I had to think about, well, what's best for me to position here. And I think it's really important that I say here, I don't consider myself an expert in things like co-production. I think I've been very fortunate to work with some people who really have very strong expertise in this. And it's something that increasingly over time I've been bringing into my own practice. And I do, you know, do and live co-production in my research, but this is not something that I'd consider myself, a leading methodological expert in. But I do, think there's lots of really useful kind of principles around this that I've learned and been learning with. And really useful kind of practical tools that I've picked up over the years. And so it's really nice to be able to share that. So I think that's the caveat on all of this is sort of reflections on my process of engaging with collaboration. And kind of particularly thinking about that as collaboration with communities beyond the institute. So, not collaboration with our academic colleagues, but actually going out into beyond that ivory tower, working with community groups, working with kind of professionals in other realms as partners to some extent in research. So I suppose that's just to give a bit of a sense of that. I began my PhD was associated with a kind of big national project. It's actually the final report from that has just come out today. It's been years and years in the works. But I joined that project in 2016 to do my PhD, and there was a strand of that work around co-production. Now that was particularly co-production in the programme that we were evaluating, and certain aspects of co-production did come into some of the ways that we did that evaluation. And so that was my sort of first taste, was having some occasional engagement with young people, talking about, for instance, the way we were going to be doing interviews, or actually some of the ways we might be analysing data. And it was slightly more light touch. I'd think of it more as kind of involvement and engagement now, rather than it being exclusively co-production. I'll talk in a minute about the distinctions between that. But it gave me a really good taste of actually the value of engaging with the communities we're doing research with. In my case, it's very often children and young people, but I have had experience of working as collaborators with community groups, with adults, as well as with kind of professional groups as well. Certainly some of the points I share today might be very particularly with children and young people in mind. So that is, I suppose, worth noting. That tends to be the bulk of my experience. But yeah, over time I've been involved in and led several projects that build in either consultation or a more embedded co-production process with these kinds of groups. Often I think that's associated with more qualitative work, but I think I want to say up top, that's not the only way that these community groups can be involved in research. I've done systematic literature reviews with young people where they've been involved directly in not just decision making, but the actual process of finding and screening literature and making sense of that literature. I've been involved in some work around kind of quantitative analyses, and that's something I'm building particularly more towards. We're developing a secondary data analysis grant, hopefully to be funded, and that will be with young people. So, you know, there's all kinds of ways that that can happen in research processes, many of which I've been working through over the last few years. So yeah, it's become increasingly that co-production is my starting point, but it has depended on the project over time. I'm sort of more working towards that being the core model that I would use. So just to explain what I'm talking about with those terms, when we talk about collaboration with communities that's beyond kind of academic contexts, we tend to be talking about engaging in some form of consultation process or a more active kind of partnership. And there's different words that and terms that are kind of used there. One of the most common that's picked up is patient and public involvement and engagement, or PPIE. Again, you can see that that stems from kind of health service work. You know, that patient element of things is there, which sometimes confuses people in the field I'm in, where we're trying to be less medicalized with the mental health work that we do in more community spaces. But yeah, PPIE is very commonly used as a term to capture all the varying ways that we might work in consultation. To varying extents, it might be about people being drawn into decision making at a particular stage, or it can be kind of more expansive than that. What we start to move into is it can be this area here of co-production. Co-production would be a process where community members are embedded as a part of the research team. I'm going to walk through an example of a co-produced project I've led recently. And particularly some of the points I'll pick up are broadly more around co-production, of actually working in much closer partnership with people. But I'll pick on other elements of projects I've been involved with where that's maybe a bit less the case. But yeah, kind of co-production being young community members are embedded throughout that research process. There's also other approaches here that I'm going to touch on a bit less, around things like, for instance, participatory methods, where people can be kind of constructing the work themselves as participants as well as researchers. I'm less familiar with that kind of work, but it is a very interesting area where it taps into many similar principles, but has slightly more complexities. You know, ethics approval tends to need to be in place, for instance, in a way that it's not always with co-production or PPIE, depending on what's happening. And there are many more, but I just wanted to kind of pick up on some of the key terms and sort of say I'm more focusing on the co-production element of things. I did just briefly want to get a sense of kind of where people are coming at this from. So I'm going to put a couple of questions in the chat. Hopefully I can see the chat at the same time as sharing, although maybe not. I'll figure that out once I've got it up. My first question, if people were happy to share in the chat, was just, well, why do we collaborate in these ways? Why would we want to engage with the community members that we're, you know, doing research about, and why that would happen? I'm not sure I can see the chat at the same time, but I'll leave the question there, and then I'll come away from the slides in a moment to look at the answers. So if you just take a minute to add that in. And another question, I can't see if people have already still pondering or have written things in. Another question here would be around kind of, on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you at the moment in this kind of collaboration? I realise there may be people with all kinds of different levels of experience of this in the virtual room. So how confident are you on a scale of 1 to 5, also in the chat? And then finally, what would you like to learn more about today? There's only so much I can do on the fly in terms of changing. I can't change my whole presentation, but there might be points that are useful for me to pick up on a bit more than I might have done. So I'll leave those up for a minute, and then I'll have a quick peek in the chat. Right, let me see if I can see in the chat now. So different, yeah, people coming along to think about this from different confidence levels. Yeah, why we collaborate beyond the Institute learning new perspectives. I think that's a really important one, and definitely one I'll kind of pick up on a bit today. Yeah, seeing people's perspectives and where one can help in situations. Yeah, I think that's a really useful one, is how can we produce work that's useful. Nothing about us without us. Yeah, that has really come from a very activist sphere, and it's been really adopted into particularly the co-production movement agenda. I don't know what the word is for that, but that, you know, all of this, what you very often hear, that nothing about us without us. We shouldn't be making decisions and producing knowledge about people without having those people in the room. And I think sometimes it's easy in some areas of research to think, you know, well, I've been a young person, or I've, you know, experienced, I have experience of this thing, or whatever it is. And, you know, that doesn't mean it's sort of current, and it's a different way of kind of understanding it. So yeah, collaboration with other researchers, someone said here, is that would be like a 5 confidence level, but collaboration with the public, less so. So yeah, definitely tapping in today into that kind of, you know, moving beyond those academic spheres and being with kind of community members or professionals beyond academia, and thinking about other spaces. I'll jump over to the slides, but I am interested to loop back to chat points, so I'll keep an eye on that. Oh, make sure I'm sharing. Okay. Please, someone shout if you cannot see my slides anymore, but I'm assuming that you can. It seems like you can to me. So I'm just going to pick up, there's different principles in place. I've picked up particularly in thinking today on NIHR's co-production principles. They came from the Involve arm that NIHR as a funder used to have. That's now called, I think it's the Centre for Engagement and Dissemination. I've got it linked at the end, but these key principles came from their work that they did that was under the kind of heading of Involve. That I think are really helpful principles that translate into kind of practical ways of thinking about this, of, you know, that I'll be picking up on today, of building and maintaining relationships, of sharing of power, including all perspectives and skills, respecting and valuing the knowledge of all those working together on the research, and also reciprocity, you know, that this is a two-way street in terms of when we build these relationships, what we're kind of looking for in them needs to be considered from both perspectives. But I'll pick up on all of these across today. So just to introduce those as a kind of framing, but there are also more context-specific principles that are sometimes useful to draw upon. So I won't go into this in lots of detail, but an example for me would be kind of Lundy's model of child participation. I'm very often kind of working with children and young people as collaborators. So for me, the Lundy model of child participation is quite useful to think about how we create space for kind of children and young people to you know, form and express views, all these kinds of things that are very kind of children's rights framed. And that's increasingly something I'm thinking about in this kind of work. So there are more contextual frameworks and lenses that can be useful when you're working with particular populations, which is just worth flagging. I'm going to pick up on those principles that I shared before, but I wanted first to give you a bit of flavour of like what this can mean in practice, like what might we be working towards here. Again, I don't consider myself an expert per se in these things. I try to live and do co-production in my own work, but that is, you know, I've had the benefit of working with some really excellent people and being able to kind of learn from them. And this is a project that I led, have been leading for the last year and a bit. We're just in the kind of dissemination phases of this now. And this was the Insight project. So just for really quick context, this was a co-produced qualitative exploration of young women's perspectives on low mood and anxiety in their population. So driven by all this concern around adolescent girls' rates of low mood and anxiety. In all that time, people haven't really asked adolescent girls or young women what they think on that issue, which never sat right with me. So that was the work we were kind of doing here, and we were doing that with young women as part of the team. And you can see my good old standard boilerplate text from NIHR that any views I express are mine and not necessarily theirs. But yeah, we were funded by NIHR's public health research programme on this work. So this is Pratyasha and Joe. Pratyasha and Joe were the young people who co-produced this project with us. They became involved once funding was in place, and this is sometimes one of the challenges here. What we did in that context was we, in developing the application for the funds that we had, we did kind of engage in what we would consider more of a youth advisory discussion. Sort of went and said, well, this is the idea, and what do you think of that, and how might we have those conversations with girls, and like what are some of the things we want to think about there. And then we built our application, and then once funded, and once we had kind of further money to pay people on a kind of longer term basis, we engaged two young people, Pratyasha and Joe, as kind of paid researchers. And we did that via Common Room UK. Common Room's a consultancy organisation that specialises in embedding youth voice in policy and provision. So an excellent partner. And again, one of the partners that I've learned a lot from. And so Pratyasha and Joe were hired via Common Room and then worked as part of the kind of core research team. They were involved with, from that point on, all of our decisions. They, designed and made decisions around all of the study processes, all of our materials, recruitment documentation, focus group guides, our distress protocol, all aspects of things, where it wasn't necessarily saying, Joe, go and write a distress protocol, to be clear. It was more having that space together to discuss, well, what do we need to think about here, and what kinds of considerations are we making? And then we put that together and kind of send it to them and say, well, what, we can go through that together now. Are there ways we can make this better? Pratyasha and Joe were involved beyond just kind of thinking about the direction of the work and the kind of process of engaging with our participants. They co-led the focus groups. So we had our research associate, Rebecca Jefferson, leading focus groups, along with either Pratyasha or Joe, depending, we'd split so that it was sort of one of them at a time, took on different focus groups. So they co-led those discussions and very actively were co-leading. We're asking questions, we're setting ground rules together. So the research associate took a bit more responsibility for some of the kind of technical things, inviting people, all that kind of thing, more of the administrative side of things. And then the kind of actual discussion was co-led. They were also actively, and particularly Pratyasha was very actively involved in the analysis and the interpretation of data. I was trying to come up with all these ways that we could remotely have them involved in coding, and trying to make sure that still stayed rigorous but was engaging. I'll talk more later today about some of the ways that we need to kind of think creatively sometimes. And I was coming up with all these convoluted ways that we could code in Word when that's not normally what we do. And they basically said, well, hang on, what software do you normally use? And I said, well, we use NVivo, but it's not very friendly. And actually, they really wanted to learn it. So, it's one of those things of, again, I'll pick up today, of actually making decisions together and not assuming that people can't do something. Actually, they were able to learn to use NVivo and did so well. So yeah, we had a process of, we would code the transcripts, and then Pratyasha would kind of layer on, would look at our coding and say, well, I don't know about that bit, and have you thought about this here? And sort of became a kind of an opportunity to enhance the way we were understanding that. So again, minimizing, this isn't about a young person being a full-time researcher. This is about how we kind of best use that space. But yeah, they're very actively involved in that. Both Joe and Pratyasha have been involved in them making sense of the kind of, once we constructed themes, which Pratyasha was part of as well, making sure that we were doing kind of sense checking, making sure that felt right to them against the data, and that, all of these things were kind of coming together, and also thinking about what we actually take away from that in terms of interpretation. We had, of course, support and training in place throughout. Debriefing after focus groups was really, really important, and making sure there was regular time to check in. We're talking about mental health issues. That can be some of the conversations, not just mental health issues, but in this case, issues of misogyny and sexism and, experiences that weren't always nice to hear about. So lots of debriefing and support in place throughout all of these things. So not just to kind of how to do it, but actually really making sure that emotional support was in place. I'm going to very briefly, I'm not going to share too much of this, but this is a video that Pratyasha and I made, that let me move back a second, the big blank screen is unsettling. When we were starting to think about presenting on these findings to different audiences, we realised that often we're going to quite academic spaces and we're sharing findings quite regularly sometimes, and that may not fit with someone who's not full-time doing this work. And so we had a conversation about actually when do people want to be in the room for the presentations, and when is there another way of doing that? Rather than it being every other week, there's another thing to come to. So our approach there was that Pratyasha and I recorded almost like a little Q&A video that I include in presentations. I'll show just the first sort of couple of minutes of that, but just to get a sense of actually, so that you're also hearing from somebody who is involved in the work, kind of about that process, rather than just me. I'll skip. I apologise that some of this is a video of me talking. You're already having enough of that.
Researcher on the Insight project, we wanted to include some of Pratyasha's reflections in presentations that we're doing. So Pratyasha, could you tell us a little bit about how you became involved in this project and why you wanted to be involved in this project?
Yeah, so I've always been very passionate about mental health, especially in like teenage girls, having been one myself. And there was a lot of sort of issues that I saw throughout, like.
Oh, I've caused a problem. Hang on.
High school and even earlier that no one really talked about, and I didn't see many people like, looking into it and trying to understand why these issues were there in the first place and like how to solve them. So I was working as a mental health ambassador with the Common Room, and then I found out about this opportunity and I thought, okay, there's no way I can pass this up. So yeah. So I'm also very interested in research, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to find out more. And yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about what your involvement in this project? I mean, I know, but for people watching this, what your involvement in this project looked like? Like, what did you do as a co-researcher in this project?
Mm-hmm. So my main roles were sort of helping lead the focus groups and in sort of like the analysis. So in terms of the focus groups, I was sort of taking the part of like finding out what the girls thought contributed to sort of psychological distress and like why mental health and sort of depression and anxiety rates so high now, and what sort of experiences they've had and how that contributes to those rates. And yeah, it was really, really interesting to hear their thoughts. And then looking back on it during the analysis, it was really interesting to see how many sort of themes kept cropping up again and again, and not just in one focus group, but across multiple focus groups.
Yeah. And I suppose on that point, when you think about, I mean, there's so much stuff that
I'm going to stop it there. It is longer, and there's another element of questioning here around how we make sense of things that I will pick up on later on. But I don't want to take up the whole time with that video. So yeah, we'd actually been reflecting very recently, because we've been writing up some of our dissemination around this, and we had a session where we just talked about actually, well, okay, let's revisit, why did we do co-production here? And how has it worked? What have we learned from doing it? And how has it helped the project? Because we're kind of writing about that in our dissemination. So I wanted to include some of the reflections that came up there. So some of the things that kind of were reflected on by all of us as having worked well is that everybody embraced co-production, that everybody understood the value of why we had young people that were part of the core research team. Everybody understood why they were there and was kind of keen to support and facilitate that. Another element that kind of came up there was that we worked quite collaboratively to navigate mutual respect, including when people disagreed, which I'm going to pick up on a bit more because it's an important point, but making sure actually we did create trusting spaces where people where everybody felt able, including young people, to put forward ideas and also to critically discuss their own ideas and others' ideas. That, you know, we worked together to create a space where that worked. You know, the co-design, certainly in terms of the benefit of that work, that the co-design that we did led to more engaging materials, absolutely the case, more inclusive materials and processes, ways of thinking about how these were online focus groups, you know, ways of thinking about how a young person, when they feels when they dial into a Zoom call, that, you know, I'm on Zoom all the time. You know, in the pandemic, I was never off Zoom. So like the feeling of what it's like around kind of having cameras on, or, you know, the context of not always having a space that's quiet, and thinking about actually how could we creatively work through those things, that I think we probably would have thought of versions of those things, but I don't think we'd have understood them in the same way and countered them in the ways that we had without having, you know, that being a discussion with young people. We certainly felt that Pratyasha and Joe co-leading those focus groups really helped to kind of lessen the power dynamics, really supported engagement from our participants. They did feel like very free discussion spaces. It's hard to know how much that's to do with young people being there, but certainly there was a particular depth to those discussions that I think was really supported there. And certainly having those conversations around analysis, both in actually Pratyasha being involved in the coding, in the theme development, as well as Joe coming in and then sense checking with us, adding nuance to our interpretation is, I think, the way we kind of thought of it. You know, it really helped us understand some of the messy areas of this, and kind of enhanced aspects of how we were making sense of things. A couple of challenges we picked up on was making sure young researchers weren't seen as a spokesperson for all young people. I think that's really important when we're engaging with community members. They're not a mouthpiece, you know, in the same way that I don't represent all researchers. You know, it's thinking about that carefully, and actually that became more of a challenge over time. Joe needed to step back from the project a little more, and so actually that was then, you know, really making sure that we didn't sort of see Pratyasha as this sole beacon of young people. So yeah, that was something we kind of really tried to actively navigate, including with Pratyasha and having those conversations. And also that navigating university systems was a challenge. Like I said, they really wanted to use NVivo. Actually getting NVivo on their computers via the IT service was possibly the hardest aspect of the project, which, to say this was a high-risk piece of work with sensitive engagement, says a lot, you know, and we were very lucky that we were paying young people via Common Room, because that is often a problem as well. It's kind of university systems not being set up for payment. So certainly there were aspects of navigating university systems that could be a real challenge here. All of that is to say, none of that is the single way to do co-production. I just wanted to give some context before I explore kind of principles and practical tips here. There is no right way. There are principles, and there are, you know, ways of thinking about and engaging in this work, and certainly it's right and ethically appropriate that we think about like power dynamics, and that we build relationships, and that we pay people, and I'll pick up on those things, but there's not one way of approaching any of that. It's very kind of principle based. So just to be clear, yeah, that's not me saying here's an exemplary way of doing it. Here's how we did it. So yeah, just to pick up, these are, you know, different community spaces that we're working in and groups that we're working with. There's different needs at play, different projects, there's different considerations, and sometimes, you know, not everything is appropriate everywhere. So just to say that's very kind of caveated. So thinking about what those principles are, that can underpin whatever way is right for us. I'm just going to pick up on those points from NAHR, and I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about each one, but really get into those kinds of practical tips. So building and maintaining relationships. I'd like to think this feels obvious as kind of the key tenet of doing this kind of collaborative work with people beyond the university, with the public and communities. We like to have relationships with our colleagues at work. I think that's, you know, when I think about the people I collaborate with most often, I have built those, you know, really trusting relationships. We know how to communicate with each other. We know kind of, we think about role specificity, who's doing what, all that kind of thing. That becomes so much more important when we're working with these groups, who you know, maybe don't have relationships with these kinds of institutional spaces and people, and that can kind of feel all kinds of ways. But also that not everybody's always having research conversations and feeling really free to talk about this thing and that thing. And actually all of that takes time to kind of build the foundation for. So in terms of tips around that, there's tips around kind of building, but also I think maintaining relationships is really important not to overlook here. So in terms of actually identifying relationships, I would say if you're feeling unsure about how to actually find people to do this, as I said, I've worked with Common Room quite a lot. They tend to have young people who are working with them on lots of different projects, but also connections to lots of different charities and organisations that they might kind of recruit via. But I've also worked with kind of partner organisations like youth trusts who already, you know, have those channels with young people. I found that a very and also by schools, actually, in some instances for me, of actually it's, you know, working with a particular school, and that's something that we're looking to build as a longer term approach of kind of having partner schools where the young people, you know, we have a small group of young people who are kind of trained and have a long-term relationship with us. So there's all kinds of ways of doing that, but I do think that that organisations, charities, trusts, settings that your community members are in, actually, that can be a really valuable way of not just finding people, but also supporting them. You know, working via Common Room means that Pratyasha and Joe they didn't just have support from me and Becca and other researchers, they had support from Common Room of people who were really well trained to debrief. Similarly, when I work with youth trusts, you know, that gives us really good systems to be working in terms of safeguarding, in terms of payment, in terms of like the physical space we can be in, and the support and kind of professional advice we can get from people who work every day with these people. From professionals. So thinking about going via organisations actually has lots of benefits in building those relationships. But then when you actually have some people in the room with you, tips I would give are making sure that you do create time and space to get to know one another as people. I think that there's more of a need for that than there often is when we're working together on research projects. As I said, you know, there's different kind of levels of that, and I think that's really important when we're working with community members, that actually that does take time to build on a human level as well as kind of in a role-based way. You know, when I think of me as a researcher coming in, there's sometimes quite a lot of mistrust with some communities, quite rightly, I think. And also, not that I'm somebody not to be trusted, but certainly mistrust of research communities and the Institute, I think, is something that I've come across quite a lot. And in other spaces, it's more about kind of, you know, researchers seem intimidating. When I'm thinking about children, they often think of us as, you know, researchers wear lab coats and they're in these buildings far away and they know things and they're clever, and we don't, and we're not. But we're seen that way, and that you know, breaking through those barriers to get to know each other on human levels can be really important and build that trust. Making sure everyone in the team understands their role. By that I mean researchers as well as community partners. Thinking about actually making space to talk together about, well, why are we doing co-production and what is everybody's role in that, can feel really, really important. There are quiet periods quite often in projects. You know, when an ethics application is in, or when we've got kind of recruitment going on, or, you know, there can be points where there's kind of less direct decision making being made. And I think it's really important also to think about, don't just drop off the face of the earth for these people when that's happening. You know, just catching up and having kind of a social check-in can be quite nice. You know, thinking about ways of keeping that relationship living, as it were. Keep on checking in relationships as well. How you feel things are going as a team might not be how people are feeling, and actually making time at the end of sessions together to say, right, you know, how's today been? You know, how is all of this working? Are there ways of taking that forward? You know, I've definitely had young people say, actually, I found this really hard today, or I didn't really feel this worked for me today, or I'm finding all of this a bit weird at the moment, and can we talk about that? And just keeping on making sure that we're checking in on that kind of, you know, on that relationship and how what we're doing is working. And also exploring together how relationships extend beyond the project. There's a bit of a problem with people kind of doing some research with a community and then just buggering off and not bothering to tell them what was found or what we're doing with it, or how they might be involved down the line. I try to approach increasingly now my relationships with community partners as long-term, and maintaining those connections in usually a lighter touch way, right? We're not always spending time together every month, but that actually there are ways you can think about that relationship being long-term, and we're not just picking somebody up and putting them down when they're not useful to us anymore, that actually there are ways we can kind of keep a tie over time. And there are some people who do a lot of kind of that community work where actually they are engaging with the same communities across projects, and that can be really valuable too, is that becoming a kind of long-term partnership. So building and maintaining relationships as being not just about the start, it's the whole kind of process. Sharing of power. There are power dynamics. We have to accept that, and we can't necessarily always dismantle that, but we do need to be really conscious about the power dynamics that are at play, and be open about that, and be thinking actively about how we share that power, and try and deal with some of those challenges that arise through kind of power imbalances. So just the practical tips here is just don't ignore it. It does require active work. It can feel uncomfortable. I don't really like thinking of myself as a person in a position of power, but I am, and that's something to be really mindful of always, but especially when you're out, with community groups and talking about issues that affect people's day-to-day lives and involving them in a world that they're not always part of. You have to be actively thinking about that. Ensuring that we are creating spaces where people can genuinely contribute, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute in terms of kind of being inclusive in that sense. But, it's no good saying we've got somebody in the room if you then keep working in the way that we're all familiar with working as researchers, where we, do a Zoom call and we share a OneDrive document and everybody goes off and does a thing like that. I'm not saying that's always great collaboration, but it's really important that we think about our role here is to facilitate those contributions, and we need to be really actively thinking about ways that we do that. Building trust and mutual respect. As I said, I think, I've definitely experienced, going out and working with partners where there is mistrust. And I think that is often informed by experience or what they've kind of seen portrayed of real situations. And that's really important to kind of be conscious of, that you can't just assume that there's trust put in you when you're in these spaces. You have to build that trust. You have to keep showing that commitment. Again, that ties to the need for those relationships to be built carefully, and the time at the start. We can't assume we can just come in and start making research decisions together. There has to be a building process that happens. There has to be establishing people being on the same page and being willing to move pages sometimes. But all of that is part of kind of building trust in these spaces and building a sense of kind of mutual respect of hearing each other. And all of that happens through that time and relationship building. And the other aspect of sharing of power here is joint ownership of key decisions. My experience in co-production is very much we're making decisions together. There are times when people might suggest a thing. I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but there are times when people might suggest a thing where I think ethically that doesn't, either university policy won't allow X, or actually there's really good reason we want to think about that carefully. And that's okay. It's okay to say that. It doesn't have to mean that you're moving into a community group and you're purely there to facilitate everything that they say. This is a joint process. You're going in there as a trained researcher. You do bring knowledge. It's just that you can't hog that. So thinking about actually that sharing of power in decisions, that actually these are decisions that need to be talked about together and need to be kind of moved towards together in a way that there's general consensus around, which sometimes can be quite hard. But that joint ownership, that people, are genuinely able to feed into decision making, and that those are arrived at together. An example of joint decision making. This is from some work that we've been doing. It's very we're just at the point of starting to design data generation tools, but this is a co-produced project with young people. These are the logos they've been designing for the project. They've recently named the project. The project is an offshoot of, people might be familiar with the Be Well project in Greater Manchester. This is an offshoot of that, that's exploring LGBTQIA+ young people's wellbeing experiences in Greater Manchester, and they've called it #BeProud. As a play on Be Well, we talked a lot about the pros and cons of maintaining a link to Be Well, and how do you capture all the ingredients of what's happening. So we've been, you know, working through even just the naming process and a logo design process with young people, where my logo is on there. I won't point to which, I don't think it's the best, but we all sat and mapped out, right, get every bad idea down, get every logo idea down, and then let's pin them all up and look at them together. So, you know, even some of those things can be kind of done in that collaborative way. I'm sharing this with their permission. They were all very excited by this logo process. It was really fun. Okay, so including all perspectives and skills. I've touched on this a little bit. There are barriers, I mean, power and otherwise, when we engage with these communities. And we have to think about how we're working in an inclusive way and kind of identifying roadblocks and thinking about actually, how do we draw on everybody's perspective in this space and the skills that people are bringing. So some practical tips around that is recognizing different entry points. Don't speak in jargon. And if you are in a team where you're co-producing work, or you've got, you know, community partners in the room in whatever capacity, if someone is speaking in jargon, tell them to stop and or interpret for them. I have often in youth spaces been saying, so and so mentioned this, then let me just explain what that is. And it doesn't have to be patronizing. It's just, we're using these terms all the time. You can't do that. You know, we need to speak in plain English, or at least if we do have to use a more technical phrase, explain what it means. Think outside the box in engaging perspectives. Like I said, you can't expect everybody to function in the way that we might with other researchers. So thinking about creative ways of having those question and kind of discussion points. You know, mind mapping on things. You know, like I said, then we said, right, let's get every bad idea for a name down, and then we just wrote everything down. I mean, some of my suggestions were terrible, other people's were great. My suggestions were awful, but you know, that was a process where we were all around this table with pens and maps. And I mean, there's kind of other ways of doing that we've engaged in that perhaps that's not the most creative example, but it is something that we maybe don't always do in a research meeting. We don't always get felt tips out and start doing stuff. So thinking about some of those ways that we can think outside the box there, but also there's tools like Miro and Jamboard, you know, that let you stick post-it notes up. We did that the other night. We met on Zoom with young people to talk about what questions we might be asking of participants. And so we just, you know, we got a Miro board up and we stuck post-it notes on with every idea, and then we started to move those around and organize that. And that can really help seeing things kind of visually take shape. So yeah, tools like that can be quite useful in just making sure that people can see we're documenting the things, but also that's happening in a way that feels quite kind of collaborative. Identifying and addressing barriers to engagement on an ongoing basis. There's going to be different barriers for everybody and different barriers for different community groups. Trying to be aware of, is somebody not coming to meetings, and actually could there be a reason for that? Or is somebody a bit quieter in the meetings, and maybe we need to understand, are we not engaging in a way that feels right for them? Or are they just wanting to take more of a listening role that week? Really trying to identify where there are ways we can be thoughtful about that. And also kind of thinking about where people feel best able to contribute. So, we've been talking in this other project about young people co-leading data generation spaces, interviews and group interviews. But some young people said, no, thanks, I don't want to do that. And I'm like, that's fine. Whereas other young people felt very keen to do that. So it's, everybody doesn't have to do everything. There's ways of thinking about where people feed in. I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to get to make sure we've got time for questions. I'll just do final couple of points. So one point here around, respecting and valuing the knowledge of everybody working together on that research. When we work, particularly in a co-production capacity, when we're working with community groups, we want to make sure it's not tokenistic, right? We want to make sure we've not just said, well, they were in the room. They were in the room and that's fine, that's the same. We can't assume that having people in the room is necessarily respecting and valuing the knowledge that they bring. So, making sure that you are establishing very clearly that everyone in the team is of equal importance, and that you enact that through the way that you do things. In Insight, for instance, everybody was at every meeting in the core team, and then we had a wider team of some other researchers who came along every now and again and kind of chipped in. So actually it was the researchers who were less important, quote unquote, in that space. But, you know, actually everybody can be chiming in on decisions. Everybody has the kind of right to be there and the right to contribute. Buy-in in the team for that is really important. If you've got someone who doesn't understand the value of these community partners being in that space, that can be a problem. My experience is that becomes lessened over time once people see the contribution that's happening, but it can be tricky. You know, you want to make sure that everybody understands why you're doing it. Increasingly, I think that is the case as it becomes more common, but not always. Collectively establishing group agreements, how are you going to behave together in that space? You know, how are you making sure people are listening to one another? How are you dealing with disagreements, all of that kind of thing? Genuine respect, and I think that comes with getting to know people and making decisions together, but making sure it's kind of, you know, you are working to respect what people bring to the table. Some of that ties into consensus and issues like that. The thing that's always stood out for me is hearing a young person say at an event a few years ago that as someone involved in kind of co-produced projects, they felt like sometimes they could say, do you know what we should do is we should punch young people in the face, and everybody in that space will go, oh, you're so insightful, how inspiring, let's punch all the children in the face because a young person said it. That's not genuine respect. It's not, you know, that's, like I said before, we shouldn't be just doing whatever everybody says. That's, you know, this is a space where it's okay to talk critically and think together about ideas. And that requires us to be respectful of everybody's contributions, and able to explore those. And so I think that's a really important point for me, is sort of a genuine respect is about a process of doing that together. Managing what consensus means. If researchers feel really strongly and outvote some community partners, that's not a consensus. You know, thinking about actually, is everybody comfortable to an extent, and is there an imbalance there, and you might need to address if that is a problem. And also, yeah, not assuming that people won't understand complex concepts or issues. Like I said, I've done systematic literature review coding with 18-year-olds. And, you know, we're involving people in kind of some complex hypothesis building over the summer. You know, there's an assumption sometimes that young people or community partners kind of won't be able to engage in those things. And actually they can if you make it something that is accessible. Final point, really important, around kind of reciprocal dynamics here. This is a two-way street. Pay people. If we're working with community partners, we need to pay them. Now, again, I'm speaking mostly around, like, I do a lot of work with young people. Occasionally my partnerships are with professionals. It's as part of their job. That's a bit different. They're being paid, depending on, you know, how much it does fall in their remit. But, you know, certainly when you're working with community members, pay them. I know that's hard in unfunded work, but I mean, the University of Manchester has so many, as an example, if you're internal, so many strategic pots that can be used. You know, there's ways of doing that. University systems can be quite restrictive here. Certainly the University of Manchester's system is tricky to pay people quite quickly. And I know that's the case at many institutes. I've found really good workarounds using, you know, payment via vouchers, which also helps with, you know, employment things when it's not always that people are employed, depending on how the setup works. And that also can speed things up, as well as partner organisations. You know, Prati Asher and Joe on that work were employed via Common Room, who have a system set up for employing young people in an appropriate way. Payment beyond formal study periods. I've been using strategic pots to make sure I'm paying people for dissemination work, but also some funders let you kind of extend funds beyond the formal end period. Making sure that everyone builds and understands the impact and contribution made in the work. And you know, again, there's a problem of people coming in, doing community engagement and then leaving, and not saying, here's what we're doing with what we all built together, and here is the ways that we can think together about that feeding back into the community. And that's not only important because of the relationships and the power issues of this, but it's also reciprocity, right? People are taking part. You're not just using them. They are coming into this wanting to construct something meaningful, and they have the right to be part of building that, as well as understanding it. And that includes authorship. You know, I'm writing academic papers and have written academic papers with young people, and other kinds of dissemination routes as well, where actually they should be listed, they should be credited for that. understanding what the people you're working with are hoping to get from the experience. Sometimes it's a career point, sometimes it becomes a career point with time. A young person that I've worked with on a couple of projects told me recently, after a day with us on something, that it's finally clicked for her. This is what she wants to do every day, and she's planning on being a mental health researcher, and she's thinking about how she can reframe her studies at the moment to work towards that down the line. And I am now here as a formal cheerleader in the long term. You know, I've given references to young people for academic kind of things, but also around jobs outside of these spaces. You know, there's all kinds of ways that actually you become a long-term contact for that person, that actually you can be quite useful. And there's also ways of thinking about how you might involve somebody based on what they're hoping to get from that experience. And sometimes that's not career stuff, sometimes that's about activism or community contribution, you know, but being aware of that is really helpful. And yeah, I'll move along so we've got time for questions, but just really making sure that we do capitalize on the connection that we can offer to somebody and the way that we can do that. I'll flag, there's a few resources. I know these slides are coming round, so this will be, the video, so be a good point to pause and have a look. But this NIHR Centre for Engagement and Dissemination is really, really helpful and replaced the previous Involve programme of work that was really, really valuable. There's loads of networks and collectives, and there's also a couple of more academic points that I've listed there that are quite useful. But I'll stop there because I'm aware I've not left as much time as I'd like for questions, and I've just been having a good ramble. So I'll stop sharing there, and yeah, any reflections or questions on any of those things.
I just think it's a really great presentation. So yeah, fascinating.
So not rambles then, that's good.
No, not at all. Just yeah.